Also, I think it's really good. I know that recently I just interviewed Dr. Sancy Leachman. You know her very well. And she and I talked a lot about this genetic testing, right? And that's what you touched on before. Some of the genes like CDKN2A genes, BRAF, PTEN, MIDF, and all those genes that you are wanting to find out if they put you at a higher susceptibility for developing melanoma. And also, if you carry some of those genes, that also put you at risk for developing, let's say, pancreatic cancer, et cetera, right? So now you and I are going to talk about the genetic expression profile, totally different from genetic testing, right? So let's go walk through the scenario. You talked about two things, right? One of it is you use this technology to assess whether a lesion is a melanoma or not a melanoma, so you can avoid doing a biopsy, right? Let's go through that first. Can you name the company that's doing this work? And I know you've done some research with them, everything else.
Yeah, so there's a company called Dermtech, and so they make a test. It's called a pigmented lesion assay, or PLA. So what it is it's really a circle of tape. And it's a kit that comes with 4 circles of tape. And so that piece of tape is placed over, if you have a mole on your arm, we're not sure if it's melanoma or not. And instead of doing a biopsy, we want to get more information. You put the piece of tape over that mole, circle it with a Sharpie pen, literally, and then take it off. And then you do that 4 times. So you've got 4 pieces of tape for each one. And in that tape within the circle, we know is material from the mole, and then outside is from the surrounding skin. So they can then you send that off to their lab. They then take out just that area in the circle of the tape, and then they can from there extract the RNA and even a little DNA. And so they can look at genetic material in that mole. And it's amazing, but when you look at after you've used the tape on the skin, it's not bleeding or broken open. You really can't tell that anything was there. It's truly non-invasive. And so but we know that some genetic material kind of comes up to the surface of the skin, and that's what's being looked at. So what they're looking for is expression of 2 genes that we know are upregulated or increased in melanoma, but not in benign lesions. They also, when they get DNA, can look for one mutation that we would call acquired, meaning you're not born with it, but it develops within that lesion, and it is what we would call a melanoma driver mutation. So we know it's a mutation that, when it occurs, helps to push something from this end of the benign end into more toward the malignant end. So they can look for the presence of those 3 genes, 2 in the RNA, 1 in the DNA, and then you get back a report. So then they send a report back to your dermatologist or the person who's done the test, and it either says none of these genes were identified, which means it's a low-risk lesion, or 1 was found, 2 were found, or all 3. And so the risk of it being melanoma, or the likelihood of that lesion being melanoma, if it's biopsied, goes up with the number of genes that are identified in that test.
So lots of questions. And I know the lab is based in San Diego, actually. And let's say you in Pittsburgh and you ship that material across the country. Is there a certain degree of stability that you will preserve the genetic material?
Yeah. So it is actually, I think that there is always this concern about sensitivity or stability. So that actually does go, like, it's FedExed or overnighted, so it's not sitting out there for a long time. The other nice thing is that, this test was validated. So, we did some of the clinical trials to see, how well this works. And this was done really under the same conditions. So it was validated with, when I did the clinical trials, I took the tape, I put it in a FedEx envelope, and I shipped it out there. So we know that it's been tested and everything's been worked out under the same conditions that we're actually using it. It's not like, we're testing it when I'm sitting right next to the lab and I hand them the piece of tape and they run it. So we know that there's enough detectable that it worked and that was developed in the same way it's used.
And what's the turnaround time? Like, by the time, let's say, you ship that stuff FedEx to the lab, the company in San Diego, how long does it take usually for you to get the report back?
It's under a week. It's usually around 4 to 5 days.
Yeah, because what they have to do is take that tape and run the assays, and
Right.
yeah, that's also a very, not an easy process. But just no question is, obviously everyone wants to know the sensitivity and specificity, right? And how good is it?
Yeah, I'll kind of talk a little bit about that. So if you look at the published studies, so there's kind of two versions of the test. One is two genes, just looking at the RNA test. The sensitivity of that is 91% and the specificity is 69%. What does that mean? That means that in the studies that were done where every lesion was biopsied, that it accurately detected 91% of melanoma. So 91% of lesions that were melanoma, as judged by 3 dermatopathologists because of all this uncertainty that we talked about, were detected. They expressed one or both of those genes. Now, if you look at the next generation test, which is those 2 genes plus that presence of that 1 DNA mutation, that actually, if you add that in, that brings that sensitivity up to 97%. So having one or more of those 3 genes identified increases the sensitivity to 97%. Specificity is how often are you right about the benign lesions? Meaning, I could be 100% sensitive if I said, everything looks like melanoma, biopsy it. I wouldn't miss a single melanoma, but my specificity would be 0%.
Yeah.
So the specificity is a little higher with the 2 gene test at 69%, and it goes down a little bit to 53% if you are using the 3 gene test. So that's an important factor. The other questions, the other things that are going to influence that, though, that's in a clinical trial setting. That means I have, my protocol was if you have any uncertainty that it's melanoma, do the test, but also biopsy everything. So basically, I could be 1 to 99% sure that it's melanoma, and that would count. So if I was 100% sure it wasn't, or 100% sure it was, we didn't put those patients in the study. But let's face it, in real life, if you or I are seeing a patient and we're 99 or 95% sure that's melanoma, we're just going to do a biopsy. We're not going to use a test, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to perform a little bit differently in the real world. So for example, if I look at the lesions that I enrolled in, one of my colleagues at Northwestern, about a quarter of our tests were positive. And of the ones that were positive, a third of those were melanoma. If you look at registry studies, they're kind of looking at thousands of tests run in the real world, not in a clinical trial setting. 8,000 tests, for example, only about 13% of those were positive, and about 13% of those that were positive ended up being melanoma. So those are probably being used on the less suspicious lesions in the real world. So they're going to perform a little bit, it's going to perform a little bit differently in the hands of, your clinical dermatologist, or in the hands of where it's being used in patient care than it did in research.
How are you using it? I mean, I can see one place, let's say lenticle malignant, right? Those are really difficult on the dermoscopy. Confocal laser microscopy may be helpful, but I think especially let's say a middle-aged woman, and taking a biopsy from the face, it can be concerning for the cosmetic reasons. And that's one place. Any other place that you can think of that?
Yeah, so I think that you're exactly right. The number one place I use it is on the face, and for everybody. I think that it's one, nobody really wants a big biopsy in the middle of their face. 2, sometimes facial lesions are actually quite large, and we know that we want to, if we're going to remove it, we want to get the entire lesion. We don't want to take a little corner of it. We want to get the whole thing. So that means that the scarring implications are high. We know that facial lesions can be, like you said, harder to diagnose. So face is probably the number one place that I use this. Women and men, all ages. The other times that I will use it are for patients who are poor, let's say that they are poor wound healers, or that they don't want to biopsy because they are tired of having a lot of scars. They're tired of having a lot of biopsies, or they feel like they've had a ton of biopsies, but they've all been negative and now they've got all these scars. So I tend to use it a lot when the patient or I want to avoid a biopsy, or when it's in a cosmetically sensitive area. In addition to the face, the chest for
yeah,
women really
yeah,
doesn't scar very well, and that's a very visible area.
yeah,
That's another place that I use a lot of it. We don't, we know that we can't use it on like the palms and soles or
yeah,
mucosal surfaces, so
yeah.
we don't ever use it on those areas. But that's it. Or if a patient is adamantly worried about something and I really think it's extremely unlikely and I would prefer not to give them a biopsy, not to do a biopsy, particularly in an area that might not heal well, that's another way that I can give patients reassuring information in addition to what I'm telling them based on my clinical judgment.
No, is this test can also be used on kids?
So that's an interesting question. It was not validated on kids.
Mhm.
Everybody in the clinical trials was 18 and over. It's not prohibited to use it, and people do.
Okay.
Um, the one thing that I will say is that, melanoma is exceptionally uncommon in kids. The genetic, sort of activity within growing nevi in children is different than what you see in adults. So when you look at their data, the positive test rate is actually pretty similar in adults and children. But we know that the true melanoma number is lower. So for example, there's one of the genes, one of the RNA that's looked at is called LINC. It's a non-coding, it's a regulatory RNA. That tends to be expressed more highly in pediatric nevi, benign lesions as
Mhm.
well,
Mhm.
than it is in adult nevi. So you're likely to get that positive test back, but that's not predictive of it being melanoma in a kid or a pediatric patient like it is in an adult. So I actually don't use this in kids. I don't have enough data to say this is going to be helpful and the results are reliable for me. So I don't use it in kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the places, looking at spits, that would be helpful, right? I mean, that's one of those areas that's spits versus melanoma that give the pathologist, dermatopathologist, sometimes some trouble. Let's shift gears a little bit.